without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first person I'm going to introduce is Mr. Kareem Sykes from the Project Spectrum team, and he is going to talk about Project Spectrum. So Kareem, please take it away.
Excellent, Rick. And as always, thank you and welcome to everyone. We're certainly glad that you all have taken time out of your busy schedules to spend it with us here at Project Spectrum. I want to first talk a little bit about, again, what Project Spectrum is engaged with, the fact that we are, in fact, DoD supported. We are a cybersecurity platform for small businesses in the defense industrial base and beyond. And Project Spectrum provides essentially free education, training, guidance, and tools that small businesses are seeking to enhance their cybersecurity practices. And so we want to make it very known that we are dedicated to helping companies achieve their cybersecurity goals, including that of the cybersecurity maturity model certification. Obviously, a lot of activity in the sort of policy landscape from a cybersecurity perspective. We just saw the publishing of the proposed new FAR CUI rule. And so some implications there, certainly as it relates to CMMC level 2. But more to come on that. But I did want to tell you about a bit about our mission. And for anyone who's not already on this call, we generally like to think that if you're on this call, you've already been in our environment, our ecosystem at projectspectrum.io. But for any small businesses that you may be encountering in your, in your spheres, please welcome them and get them to projectspectrum.io to register and take advantage of the myriad resources that are there specifically for SMBs in and around the defense industrial base. But again, any business of any size can take advantage of the resources that we provision. And those resources include cybersecurity readiness, strength and compliance by way of educational trainings, guidance, tools that are enabling businesses to be cybersecure in the face of what we've no doubt seen as increasing exposure, complexity, and regulations, right, between the CFRs, the DFARs, and the FAR, right? So through these services, Project Spectrum strives essentially to elevate the overall cybersecurity posture of U.S. businesses, manufacturers, educational institutions, and government agencies, right? So we have things like cyber readiness checks, discovery questionnaires, compliance self-assessments that are going to help businesses elevate their current cybersecurity preparedness, pinpointing vulnerabilities, identifying areas for improvement. And one of the things that Project Spectrum embodies is that Kaizen philosophy, right, of continuous improvement. Customized cybersecurity journey, right, whether it's education and training videos, we can tailor those and tailor that path, if you will, that cybersecurity path designed to enhance step-by-step your progression of effort. And so whether it's our cyber advisement team, live FTEs that we have on staff at the ready to engage, or if it's just our community support, right? So our network of small businesses in the DIB to exchange tips, share best practices, and collaborate on improving cybersecurity posture. We want you to know that we're here to support you as a small business and your cybersecurity compliance journey. So please, if you've not already, register at projectspectrum.io, and please tell as many other businesses who need support in that regard to please join us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Rick, and thank you, Mr. Barnes, for being here today. We are in for an absolute treat here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. I do appreciate that. And yes, I've presented several of these webinars for Project Spectrum, and certainly cannot say enough about the no cost to the user tools, training, and resources that are available on the site. So please be sure to take full advantage of that, because you have the ability to do so, again, at no cost to you. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest today for Cyber Circuits. We're going to be speaking with George C. Barnes. George is the former Deputy Director of the U.S. National Security Agency. We know them as NSA. And he spent 36 years there leading intelligence operations, cybersecurity initiatives, industry partnerships. He's now the president of Red Cell Partners Cyber Practice, and he specializes in cybersecurity innovation, particularly in supporting startups and small businesses in both commercial and government sectors. With deep expertise in national security, he also serves on multiple advisory boards and cybersecurity think tanks, shaping the future of cyber defense and critical infrastructure protection. George, thanks so much for joining us today on Cyber Circuits.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And it is great to have you. So, George, I'm just going to jump right in,
Sure.
if you don't mind, because, again, I think one of the things that we need to realize is that we have a lot of folks on the line who want to hear your take on some of the things that we've been saying on the Project Spectrum side. So,
Great.
we are constantly preaching to businesses within the defense industrial base and businesses nationwide, really, that they're a target. They are constantly being targeted. Now, can you elaborate on that? Can you elaborate on that from your experience, both at NSA and also as someone who specializes in helping high potential startup companies break into the defense business?
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. As was mentioned, I spent my whole life focusing on our national security, and it's really interesting, the question you posed, because we have thousands of small companies. That's what makes America what it is. That's what makes the Defense Department sing and hum and create its ability to deliver deterrence and or action if and when required. I'll position this a little bit. A lot of my life, most of my life was as an intelligence professional. I was involved in collection and exploitation operations. And so I came at NSA as electrical engineer. And in my early years, I was developing collection systems. I was deploying them on mountaintops all around the world. And then as technology continued to mature, we were able to come back from the mountaintops in a lot of cases and get into the network from our keyboards. And so I spent a lot of time directly doing this and or ultimately leading and guiding those that were doing it. And that really helped me understand the reality that you all live and we all collectively face with respect to trying to defend against very sophisticated adversaries. The adversaries that we're really focused on, they're globally distributed, but in large part focus on China and Russia. There are others to lesser degrees that are very capable, but the level of threat posed by mostly China, but also Russia, is something that you have to take seriously. You cannot take for granted. And especially if you're a small or medium-sized business. So when I was in NSA, of course, on the offensive, meaning intelligence collection and gathering exploitation side, it was our job to figure out, well, how do we get in to get those secrets from those foreign governments and about those weapons programs, command and control, all those types of things. Well, yes, you can go the hard way and you can try to go knock on the door of those organizations, or you can go the easier way. And that's really the whole thing about targeting. And I'm outlining this because this is what's happening to you and to us, is all about understanding vulnerability space. And you all spend a lot of your time in cybersecurity thinking about vulnerabilities. And of course, those are technical vulnerabilities, but they're all manner vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities come from the technical domain, but also the human factors domain. And so if I wanted to penetrate a foreign government, I would look for weaknesses in technology implementations, weaknesses in human factors, who are the disgruntled entities who have access or can gain access via technical means or otherwise. And so the whole art of targeting and exploitation is something that, that's NSA's job in the signals domain, but it's also what China and Russia and others are doing against you. And so you cannot take for granted the fact that, yes, you might have big primes that you're supporting and subcontracted to, and yes, they are very much so in the bullseye for these nation states, but you are also in the bullseye. They have a way, unfortunately, because we're an open society, all the information is pretty much accessible with respect to who you're contracting with and for what. And so they're doing social network analysis of your business. And understanding who your customers are, what your supply chains are, who the people are that you're hiring. Those are all factors in their consideration of how to target and exploit through the weakest link. Yes, going right into the Pentagon would be great, but luckily the Pentagon spent a lot of time trying to fortify its defenses. And so that's a much harder target than a very small company that has not had the time or the money or the wherewithal to stand up its defenses like a lot of the big primes have, much less the government. And so you are dead on in the target. And it's kind of like the unfortunate things that happen like a few weeks ago in California with forest fires. Everybody always hopes it's somebody else. Well, you never know who it's going to be. And just read the news any given day these days with penetrations, foreign nation penetrations into our businesses, into our infrastructure, but also ransomware penetrations. So it's not just what's happening by governments, but also sophisticated actors, whether they're kids, whether they're adults, whether they're consortiums, they're all out there for a cause, and that's to find our weaknesses.
And now I would have to say that this probably doesn't just involve small and medium businesses that are already doing business with the Department of Defense or any federal agency. It's any business that would want to be part of that supply chain, the federal supply chain, because the bad actors they're not looking necessarily for just that backdoor into the larger primes and then into the government systems. There are a lot of other targets within a small and medium-sized business that, say, in the manufacturing sector, that those nation states and those threat actors are going to find valuable, correct?
That's right. And that's where things really come together. If you look at the interests, I'll just use China. It's the easiest thing. China's interested, of course, in our defense apparatus, in our intelligence apparatus, in all manner of government, and all of you all that serve those organizations. But hey, just look at the headlines the last couple of days. We're in a technology race with China. And so, the US has been the foundation of innovation in the world. We've been at the bleeding edge of technology. Some of that technology is used, of course, for national security and defense, but a lot of it's used for all manner of outcomes across the landscape in which we live. And so advanced manufacturing, look what's happening with integrated circuits, microelectronics, what we're trying to do to preclude China from stealing our designs and selling them back to our customers and really taking and disrupting the value chain of innovation. And so in many respects, there's an intersection of technology, its application, its customer base, its supply chain. And so to your point, Rick, we are not only in the bullseye if we're currently supporting government contracting, much less defense contracting. If we're out there working in the high tech sector, we are also of interest. And, China sees national security differently than we have traditionally seen it. They think if it's in their interest as the preeminent superpower in the world, they're going to get it. They'll get it the easy way, or they'll get it the not so easy way. And so that means intellectual property theft. That means penetration via human means. And so we really have to take seriously not only the fact that we are under pressure, but we're under pressure by an increasingly sophisticated adversary.
Yeah, and those adversaries, like you said, they're getting even more and more sophisticated, particularly within the way that they are targeting some of these small businesses. I know you mentioned ransomware before, and then I've even heard of extortionware
Sure.
lately is something else that's really jumping up there. So, can you maybe get into, some of the tactics that these, the nation states and the threat actors are using that companies really need to be aware of?
Yeah, it's really, it seems obvious, it's depressing, but it's real. And that's the whole reality of a lot of things that we've been sensitized to, but human nature is the weakest link. And so if you look at most penetrations, they're through the weaknesses of us humans. We're all under pressure. We're looking for efficiency and speed. And so we like to cut corners. And so I'll just use the easy thing like passwords. Keeping passwords fresh and different and not making them proper nouns, things like that, using multi-factor authentication. Those are just plain and simple for us and our identities as humans connecting to devices, but it's also about things, the identity of things. Everything's interconnected and networked these days, and we're enjoying the efficiency and speed of that, but that expands the attack surface. And so I'll just use recent examples with China and like Salt Typhoon, which is going into critical infrastructure. They're basically penetrating easily penetrable known weaknesses, antiquated operating systems in, small office, home office routers, old equipment that's sitting there has not been paid attention to, and that comes right into your businesses. And so they are looking and taking advantage of the things that we had forgotten, right? And so keeping an inventory of all your assets, making sure that they are up to date with respect to all the software updates that the service providers can push into your systems, they have to be up to date because the landscape on firmware and software is continuously changing. And so we can't, it's hard enough even if we've buttoned everything up, but unfortunately, human nature and the breadth of what we represent as a target make us easy targets.
And then, I also know, as of late, even some of my colleagues here at Project Spectrum have been hit with some of these social engineering, where they're masquerading as somebody from the company trying to get you to buy gift cards or, oh, could you click on this link and check out this presentation for me? I've got to give it to the board of directors in the next 15 minutes. And like you said, it's that human nature. We're so eager to help that we don't stop and think, would this person really be sending this to me?
Yeah, and we're stressed. We're busy. All of us have pressures, and so nothing worse than a log jam in our email queue and trying to get through whatever we have to do in a given day with all of our deadlines and pressures. And so that's prey for those who would actually leverage our preoccupation. It's happened to me. It's happened to all of us, I'm sure, and especially now with social engineering integrated with artificial intelligence. And so that has really been a force multiplier to not only expand the breadth, but also the authenticity of phishing expeditions. And so it's really changed the game. And you mentioned the authenticity piece. I mean, that is just really coming on with light speed against all of us. And so we have to pause before we click. We have to think, and we have to know what's coming at us. One of the things, there's all the techniques we learn about hovering over things, but also when you get emails, forward it, just try to forward it so you can see who it's from. If just little things, much less more sophisticated ways of just seeing who is that coming at you. Is this really authentic? And so we've got to realize that. I think Verizon's annual outline of penetrations last year, and this is almost a year old, was like between 60 and maybe 70% human factors were the reason for breaches. And so we've just got to realize we're all preoccupied by hardware and software and all those types of things. But in the end of the day, humans touched all of it, and we are the weakest link.
Yeah, we often use that old acronym PEBCAC, problem exists between chair and keyboard. And it really is, as much as we're trying to make light of it, but that really is what happens. Now, I do want to jump back to something that you mentioned when you were talking about the critical infrastructure. You were talking about that dated equipment. And it's really interesting because on the Project Spectrum side of things, in the past, we've talked to manufacturers and, they're running a shop floor and they're using the same computer that's running the same software for the last 5-6 years. And to them, there's not a problem because it still works. It still makes the widget. But this is on a system that was never designed to have the type of security that is needed in the current day and age, right?
Correct. That's right. And so that's a big challenge. I lived it when I was at NSA. I mean, we had some very old systems that were critical, that really needed to be modernized, but we didn't have money to do it. And so that's a big risk. We were preoccupied by making sure you could actually even get parts to replace hardware failures in some of this equipment. But just think about the operating system vulnerabilities that lie latent in these systems. And so it's a big issue. And that has come really home to roost in the US with Bolt Typhoon because of this whole issue of critical infrastructure in areas that just would never have conceived that they were at risk, like municipality water systems and those types of things. They have not only old equipment, but a lot of that equipment, A, it's really expensive to replace. B, the networking technologies employed when it was developed were very simple. And so a lot of times there's not new operating systems in the IT sense to actually connect through into the OT sense to drive a lot of this equipment. And so it sits there. And we just hope and pray that nothing happens. Well, we're learning, unfortunately, that that's a great place to roost and hide and wait for the day of your choosing.
And even, we're talking not even stuff that's that old these days. Microsoft is, just came out and let everybody know that Windows 10 is sunsetting.
Yeah.
And Windows 10 systems are still going to operate just like, everything before, we had Windows 9 and we go back to Windows XP, we go, Windows 2000 or 98 and 2000. I can remember all those days where they would come up and say, okay, so this operating system is sunsetting, so we're not going to support that anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that your computer is going to stop working. It doesn't mean that your Microsoft apps are going to stop working. But what it means is that they're not going to get those updates.
That's right.
And those updates, the system updates, every time I'm on a Zoom call or a Teams call with somebody who pulls up a Google Chrome window and it says update available in the corner, and they're just not clicking that button because
That's right.
they're like, oh, I don't want to restart Google Chrome. Why do I need to do that? And you have to try to drill into them. It's a security thing. Every
That's right.
time you're not updating your system, you are leaving it open for a threat actor to jump in somehow. And they already know how. They're just I think Microsoft said that the deadline is October 14th. There are threat actors who are salivating at October 14th because they've
Oh,
got
yeah.
their whole game plan laid out, right?
That's right. That's right. And just look how fast vulnerabilities are turned into exploits now. I mean, I was just reading something this morning about the mean time to exploitation has gone dramatically down. I forget, it was 27 minutes or something was one stat. And so there are teams of people and there are teams of algorithms that are stood up, watching, waiting, and ready to pounce on these things. And so we've got to realize the scale of what's coming at us. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people, and I'll just use like the Chinese cyberspace force, much less the MSS over there, and much less the other countries like Russia. There are thousands of people with tons of technical capability at their fingertips, at their keyboards. And so the scale of what they're launching against us across the totality of our society is something that is really hard to imagine. And so you have to really understand what we're up against. They are patient learners, and so they're very strategic. They think the long game, and year on year, they're a learning in aggregate, a learning organization. And so years gone by, we always used to laugh because they were sloppy and simplistic. That's not the case anymore. And a lot of what they learned was by and through penetrations into the US and sitting over the shoulder of others and patiently watching and learning what works, what doesn't, how to emulate it, how to actually build upon it. And so we've got to realize we're dealing with learning organizations that have a different drive and motivation than we do based on how their country operates.
And I have to say, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your time at NSA, specifically as a deputy director, because one of the things this is an old saying from long ago, but we had the saying, it takes a village.
Right.
And that became sort of a rallying cry to, we have to work together. And so, I have to think that, those who are supporting any type of federal agency, anybody within a manufacturing community, within industry, within academia, they have to realize that it really needs to be that collaborative effort. And I understand that you had quite a few collaborative efforts when you were at NSA,
Sure.
particularly how you would work in concert with other agencies, FBI and others to really leverage their authorities in pursuing the bad guys. But it's not just about pursuing the bad guys, it's also trying to keep them out, right? And learn
That's right.
from them.
Most definitely. And so, one of the great things about our country can actually work to our disadvantage when it comes to working with autocratic nations. And so we create statutory frameworks and delineations of purview. And so there's a difference between what intelligence operations can do versus law enforcement versus defense. And I'll just use those three as an example. They all have to actually come together in synchrony because the adversary knows no boundaries. They don't recognize physical boundaries. We're based on physical boundaries. We have to create boundaries somehow based on to delineate purview of authority and focus. And so what that does is it kind of chops up the landscape, whereas the adversary sees it as all one ball, right? And so, and this is what happened with 9/11. The handoffs between the authorities there were gaps in those handoffs, right? And we weren't working closely enough together. We've learned subsequently the horror of not doing that well, but then taking those lessons learned and pushing into the world of cyber. A lot of time has been spent between NSA, FBI, Cybercom, CIA, as an example. Those four all working network operations for the government, as an example, had to really understand their strengths, their limits, their purviews, their focus, and how to really leverage each other for combined effect against increasingly sophisticated adversaries. And it's tough. I mean, look at ransomware. We've got foreign nationals harbored by foreign nations who basically are coming into our country, holding us hostage, getting millions of dollars. And what pressure have we been able to put on them? And so that gets into not just understanding our purviews, but understanding the limits of our statutory framework relative to the reality of today. And so that's where some of the work I do is trying to help create thoughts about pushing the envelope of relevance of our statutory framework, making sure that our laws are fit for purpose for cyber time, and that's a real challenge because the people that know our laws better than most of us do are our adversaries, and they use that to their advantage. And the first thing they do for network operations is obfuscate through U.S. network infrastructure, because that creates handoffs and authorities between the organizations. And obviously, if you're performing defensive network operations domestically, there are a lot more checks and balances that we put in place for good, strong reasons that slow us down. And so having warrants in place for domestic targeting for law enforcement purposes is rigorous on purpose, but foreign adversaries in cyber are very fluid relative to that. And so we have to find out how to maximize what we can do with our authorities, but also continue to test ourselves to make sure our authorities actually are enabling us to do the job we need to do.
And then, we've talked about on the federal level, but that also really has to filter down into then state and local, because government is government, and right. Everything is interconnected when it comes to government. Local governments are going to filter up into state governments are going to filter up into the federal government. And so it's really about not just sharing that intel, among the federal agencies, but it's also making sure that it filters down.
Most definitely. And that's where a lot of work has happened to really leverage the National Guard for cyber across the states. And so over the last years, there's been a concerted effort to use National Guard entities to take on defensive cyber roles for their respective states. And I know Cybercom, for instance, has very close and growing connections with them because, to your point, we've got to get information where it's actionable in a time of relevance. And that's really hard when you have super sensitive, fragile, classified information, but you only have minutes sometimes to take action. And so luckily, the government has gotten a lot better. There are a lot of frameworks that have been developed over the last years through the School of Hard Knocks, because we've seen the ability of foreign adversaries to actually get inside of our networks and wreak havoc. And so with every passing iteration of that, we've learned what hasn't worked and we've refined. But we always have to actually self-diagnose our weaknesses. We're always going to be imperfect, and so we have to be a learning, evolving organization in the whole of the U.S. to confront those risks.
Right, and then and I have to think that again, it's all about that collaboration. It's all about that information sharing, and I know that the organizations they're getting intel from foreign partners, and whether it's foreign adversaries or foreign allies, and then when it comes to sharing that information, I mean, is it really difficult? Because so again, we want to protect the public sector, of course, but then we also have to remember that the private sector is involved in this too. Is it really tough to be sharing that information that you're getting from those foreign resources with with folks. Again, we always look at clearance, and we always look at, how things are supposed to be classified versus unclassified and whatnot. I mean, is it difficult to have that information disseminate throughout without tipping hands or letting them know too much about, what we're doing?
So it is definitely, it is difficult, it has been, but things are changing to make it better. And so one of the things that's changing is the fact that industry is playing an increasingly significant role in cybersecurity. And so industry has a sensing array. All the big telco and internet service providers and the companies, they now are playing a role. And so a lot of times, and I'll use NSA's evolving role in this as an example, because NSA in about 2019 or so got authorities delegated from the CIO of the DoD. At that time, it was Dana Deasy. And that delegation enabled NSA to have bidirectional data exchange with defense industrial base entities with respect to threat data. And so that authority came down. At the same time, industry was increasingly able to bring their data to the table. And so when you have two sets of data of relevance on a threat or a penetration, that creates an opportunity such that the industrial data can be used as the open piece. The classified data can be used to corroborate or create attribution or verification. And so you don't necessarily have to expose the classified data. And whereas not that many years ago, we're in that situation. And so that's where this partnership is not just about data exchange, but it's actually, we're all conducting defensive operations, and we're starting to leverage the fruits of those for common outcomes. And so that's a very big game changer. And I just see that accelerating forward. And one of the things that I'm hoping with every administration change and an ability to kind of look at what's working and what could work better, there are limits on NSA's ability to do that because the authority was delegated from a defense perspective. There are many areas where NSA might be able to share data with other sectors that are not defense, but there's a limit on the authority, right? And so, because companies want a bidirectional value-added exchange. They don't want to just give data. They don't want to be told what to do without having, they want a relationship, a value relationship, so our collective security is better. And so we're on the path to get there. We have a long ways to go, but I think those major changes have really enabled us as a country to turn a corner.
And then, we constantly try to bring the message back down to small and medium-sized businesses because, obviously when you're talking about the larger organizations, you're talking about, industry and you talk about the large prime defense contractors, they speak a totally different language when it comes to cybersecurity than the small and medium-sized businesses, particularly the businesses. Again, you're talking 5 or less employees. You're talking, the person who handles, network admin access is also the person, who might, clean up the shop floor at the at the end of the day. So,
but one of the things to help there is, the government is trying to recognize that reality. And so I'll just, to pull the thread further on NSA, the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, that organization does all this bidirectional exchange with industry, but they also have contracted for services that DIB entities, small people listening here, can subscribe. So Protective DNS is a service that's provided for free, contracted by NSA on behalf of defense industrial base companies. And there are a couple other services that have come online in the last couple of years. And so creating a connection with the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, finding out what they can give you for free, finding out what guidance is there. They put a lot of advisories out, a lot of guidance. They work with other mission partners outside of DoD, like CISA, of course, who also does protective DNS for the federal civilian agencies. But by and large, these entities in the government are increasingly recognizing that we don't want our innovative, small, young companies to be the weakest link. We need to help them be strong and defend against things that they can't even know are happening to them. And so that's all part of the journey. And so again, for all of you all listening here, in my current role today, and I'm trying to create new companies for cybersecurity. And part of the customer base is the DoD. So my new companies are going through the same things that you all are living, and that is giving me more texture on the struggles of, you're trying to actually get your product in place to create value, while at the same time you've got to spend money defending your intellectual property and your networks from thievery out the back door. And so there are a lot of pressures on you, and that's why we need to come together with things like Project Spectrum to really collectively figure out what we can do.
Excellent. For those of you who are tuning in, we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask some questions. we're gonna take some questions and we're gonna cultivate them, and I'm gonna be posting them to George. So if you are willing, or if you're wanting to ask a question, please make sure it's either in the chat or in the Q&A panel. The Project Spectrum team is feeding them over to me. So one question that we have: what information are threat actors looking for that people can pay attention to, particularly when determining authenticity? Are they looking for data, or are they looking for access to connections with government entities? A little from column A, a little from column B, and even from column C that we haven't mentioned?
Yeah. So unfortunately, that's a hard answer. So you have to understand what's your value proposition as a company, and what's your value proposition to an adversary. And so that could be a couple things. You could be a value proposition just because you enable network access. There might not be anything in your company that the adversary cares about, but if you are easily penetrable, you can be a path for them to get up to your prime or to your government customer, right? And so a networking path, getting in, moving laterally, all those different types of things that we are learning about and needing to defend against, and all the principles of zero trust and all those types of things apply. So that's just from a penetration vector perspective, using you as a road, a pathway to get to others. So that's part A. Part B is, okay, what do you do? What's your value? What data do you have? What intellectual property are you developing? What's the value of that to someone else? It just pains me to see pictures and descriptions in the press of new Chinese weapon systems, for instance, because they look a lot like ours, and so they're not spending all the time and the waste of their energy to go develop from scratch when they can just like jump on a keyboard and steal designs right out of our coffers. And so whatever your intellectual property is that creates value for the government, that is of value to other governments that are standing up defense programs, for instance. And so those are two dimensions: you as an access vector, you as a value chain supplier. And so the whole supply chain is a real big thing. And we think about software supply chains, and we also think about the physical ones and their intersection. Both are critical for all you companies. And sorry, there's one more. There's the people piece. And so we have to realize that insider threat programs need to be thought of. As you mature and grow as a company, you need to really consider that. A, for your own intellectual property preservation, but B, to ward against being penetrated by foreign actors from a human dimension perspective. And so that gets into, how do you vet your employees? What are the standard security processes? What do you have in place for your employee base that isn't even working classified work, but is working government contracting, for instance? Those are increasingly important, because the strength of the U.S. is the weakness of the U.S. The strength of the U.S. is we're an open society. We are a melting pot of the world. But what that does is it creates opportunity for autocratic nations who don't give us reciprocal access, for them to come in and work among us and work themselves into positions of leverage.
Right. And there are obviously a lot of things that, a lot of businesses unfortunately don't take into account. Like you said, who's working for them, who are they giving access to? And, it's, again, something we really always preach on the Project Spectrum side, is making sure that not everybody has access to everything all at once.
That's
because
right.
you definitely don't want that. The other thing that has really come up lately has been foreign ownership, control, and influence, or what we call FOCI.
Yeah.
And when you have a small business that wants to ramp up production quickly because they want to qualify for a government contract, they're willing to take that money from anybody who will give it to them because all they can
Well,
see are the dollar
right.
signs ahead, right?
That's right. And we're all in a race. We're in a race, obviously, to provide service for our customers. We're in a race because we're competing against other companies, right in our own backyard, much less competing against a foreign nation. And what's happening now, of course, year on year, technology enhances our efficiency, our speed, our precision, and we all capitalize on that. But a lot of times we feel like it's free, and so we don't think about the real cost. Of course, the real cost is, subscribing to the services, making sure we have compute and all the things that you think about. But other things you don't think about is the true cost of risk reduction, risk management, resiliency considerations. And so that's where, and I've just used what's happened with the R1 model out of China, DeepSeek in the last week. People are racing to that. Well, it's sitting in China. So, a lot of people are just thinking, well, I'm going to use that model because it might be better than others. It's fast, it's efficient, whatever. Well, it's sitting in the house of an adversarial nation. And so, number one, it's already been advertised that if you ask things about China, you don't get really good answers. But number two, China has full access to anything that transits its network. It doesn't have FISA. It doesn't have all the things, Title I, and all the things that we have in the US that protect rights, interests, privacy, civil liberties, and business interests. They don't have that. Everything is for the CCP, right? And the same with Russia. And so if you're a company sitting within the confines of either of those countries, their law provides direct, full, unfettered access to all the comms transiting. Don't believe they're not making use of that. And so, that's something we really have to think about if we're trying to leverage these models that might be fast, efficient, and cheap, but they're learning all about what you're doing silently for use at a time of their choosing. And so we've really got to think about that reality.
So another question that we've gotten is from someone who has actually been targeted, and they're really asking about, tools that are available to help distinguish. So for the example that they gave is between a fake PO and a real one. And again, this is one of those instances where it's not necessarily human error, but it's just like you said, human nature. Somebody sends an invoice and says, this is past due, click here to make payment or your account is going to be suspended. It clicks into your brain that you want to click as quickly as possible and start dropping credit card information in there. So what kind of tools are there available for businesses who are looking for that type of protection?
The first tool is paranoia. We have to be, unfortunately, and I'm inherently optimistic, but my life in the world that I lived and knowing what we could do and what others could do against us created a sense of paranoia. And so, and you have to have healthy paranoia. You can have negative paranoia, but the healthy paranoia says you have to pause and think before you act. And I'm saying that, and I've turned around and I've clicked, but luckily my current company, Red Cell Partners, our service provider that we work with, emails that don't come from a source with whom we're dealing with, they automatically come with a banner and they have a quarantine until you pull them out. And so those are measures that we've put in place because we're rigorous and paranoid. And phishing things do come in, right? And so we send them off to the managed service provider desk for diagnosis or what have you. But luckily, most of these emails that we get in our company have these banners that force you to think like, oh wow, they've put this right on the email that this isn't normal. But that doesn't mean that things don't slip by. And so you really have to think, is this, and anything that's prompting you to give up information, don't do it, And what I do, if I got something the other day and it looked extremely valid, I went independently and logged into my account with that service provider independent from anything I got in the email. And it was a bill, it was like a medical bill, but I was nervous about getting this text saying, hit this link and pay what you owe. And so I went into my portal and there it was, and I paid it through the portal. I didn't use the link I got in the text. And so it's just taking that extra step and just stepping back and saying, I don't give anything out unless it's on my terms. And when somebody's prompting you with a link like that, you've got to question, is it on your terms or whoever's terms? And you don't know who it is.
And then, so let me ask this, you know, we've talked a lot about domestic partnerships.
Yeah.
When it comes to protecting, protecting our data, protecting our intellectual property, protecting our systems, protecting our people, protecting our critical infrastructure. What role do foreign partners play in that type of activity as well?
Yeah, an amazingly significant role. And some of these roles are tangible and some are intangible. And so the tangible role is, we actually are collectively in a situation, and I'll just say, the liberal democratic nations versus the autocratic nations, just to make two camps, right? Where we have autocratic nations that are causing mischief, and we see Iran in the Middle East. I've mentioned Russia, China. There are a bunch of nations, and then there's some that are just teetering and they're subject to influence. And that's where China has a lot of play because they're influencing weak nations through money, through supposed investment, which has a lot of terms that a lot of these countries don't realize. And it's hard because countries, especially ones that are weak or poor, they need critical infrastructure. And if somebody comes in and says, I'll update your roads and your IT, it's hard for an elected official to say no, right? And so that's a problem there. We, on the other hand, have to seek, develop, cultivate, and leverage partnerships from countries of similar perspective and situation. And so we do that. The U.S. do that in cybersecurity, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's been extremely important in the last couple of years with ransomware, because ransomware has really exploded in the last 3 or 4 years across the world, and the ransomware entities are going where the money is, and a lot of the money that's accessible is in the open and free nations. And so, in the last couple of years, the U.S. was part of building a consortium of over 40 countries that were coming together multiple times a year to figure out how to collaborate to actually counter the expansion and the ability of ransomware actors to actually be effective, get money, and build on themselves. And so that's just from a law enforcement globally perspective was the force multiplier. And then you get into defense operations. Of course, all of us deal with a lot of our allied nations. We've dealt with the European nations forever. Now we, the U.S., have been building, tightening, expanding partnerships in Asia, which is of increasing significance based on the threat of China. And so you can't underestimate the power. And one of the things, having worked the China problem for many years, nothing frustrates them more than the fact that we have an ability to create partnerships. It can be the smallest little nation. It's just the symbology of these countries coming together for common cause. Russia and China don't have partnerships. They have transactions. And so it's just a different dynamic, and the way that we can actually cultivate partners really frustrates them. And so that's significant unto itself, because it means we're locking arms with sister nations of all shapes and sizes, and we're countering the threats and the influences that they're posing on us.
Excellent. And then, obviously we have a lot of people that are really interested in of course, your former life at NSA. Somebody is asking if there are any examples, obviously sanitized. Wouldn't want you to release anything you're not supposed to, but were there any examples of some big lessons that you learned during a cyber crisis while you were at NSA?
Well, yeah, there were a lot of lessons. especially in the early days. In the early days, we were not ready for the reality, and so we learned. I remember back in like 2008 or 7, there was a Russian penetration that affected a lot of operating systems across our landscape, but including in the government, and trying to figure out how to organize yourself for incident response. You know, we do all kinds of things for defense. We always will, and we need to plan for a bad day because invariably it's going to happen. And so that's where this whole concept of resiliency comes in, is being able to recognize that, you know, something's going to knock part of you over. What's your ability to withstand that recoil and sustain your business? And so that's building on the comp. Now, it's easy for me to say that. That takes money, right? And so money is a big deal, and investment in security is a big deal. And I know that in the corporate realm, there's a continuous bleeding out of money for security because it's a big sap on margins, right? But we have to realize the cost of business includes that money nowadays. And so we have to kind of refactor what the true cost of business is and plan for that as we're doing all of our accounting and finances with respect to our margins. So the landscape is changing, and we have to recognize that and roll with it.
And I think that's one of the lessons that we often point to within Project Spectrum when we're talking to, to our different registered users. We understand that cybersecurity, first of all, cybersecurity is not a destination, it's a journey. There's no winning it. And we understand that there are some businesses that are going to be resource constrained because, again, they're focusing on production. They're focusing on ramping up on staff. They're not focused on putting the money into cybersecurity. But think of the cost of 1 or 2 days of downtime because you've been hit with the cyber incident. And again, you deal with startups. So, when you're talking about that funding and you're talking about the fact 1 to 2 days of downtime and complete downtime. Nobody is doing anything. Nothing's running. Nothing's being made. No bills are being paid. No money is coming in. Nothing. It is shut down for 1 to 2 days. And that's a best case scenario sometimes,
That's
right?
That's right.
And
I mean, a big thing to do
about
is
that cost.
Yeah. For every company, do an analysis of your critical assets. What, if you can list down priority, those things that must be sustained under all circumstances. A lot of people don't think about the obvious, like payroll. If payroll stops, people stop, right? And so think about your critical assets, and then think about the technologies that are leaned upon to stand up and sustain those critical assets. And so doing an asset-oriented risk analysis and tying that into cyber security vulnerabilities and exploits, there's a nexus there. I've been dealing with a former NSA colleague who's at University of Maryland, and he's been looking at this intersection of asset priority criticality and cybersecurity risk, and trying to and creating algorithms to actually join those so that companies and or government institutions that have a lot of complexity can actually unwind that and figure out, well, where do I need to put my next dollar? And it might not be a place that I was thinking about because I hadn't correlated. I was thinking about just vulnerabilities in hardware, but if it's in something that's not critical to sustaining my business operations, I might not put it there first, right? And so we have to really come back, and companies do this to live, is understand the bottom line and how that ties to the risk of sustaining your operations.
Well, George, we are coming to the top of the hour, and I have to say, I have enjoyed this conversation. I could talk about this for another hour or two, but we want to be respectful of all our attendees' time. So, if you had to give 1 or 2 final takeaways from this webinar for, again, small and medium-sized businesses, whether they're part of the DIB or they want to become part of the DIB, or they just are, trying to become more cyber compliant, what would those be?
Okay. Paranoia, healthy paranoia. You are a target. Understand your critical assets. your data, your intellectual property, your networks, those things that continue to generate revenue for your company, and the value you provide to your customers. We're in a situation, the world is getting increasingly disrupted, complex, fragile. It's going to get worse probably before it gets better. We're in a race. We have a national security establishment that is really having to change focus. I mean, yes, we think about weapon systems in the Defense Department, but I told many people in the last couple of years, Commerce Department is right on the front lines of national security now, because our technology is what creates our power in the US. And so protecting our technology, staying the preeminent developer of technology for the world is a big deal. And so you all have a really critical role in all of this. And so just take that to heart, continuous learning, connecting, collaborating, realizing you feel alone, but you're not alone. There are resources out there. Things like this venue are really key. So you can air your anxieties, pose your questions, try to get answers, and understand who is out there you can lean on and collaborate with. So really appreciate it.
Excellent. And George, thank you so much. Now, for anybody who did ask a question, if we did not get to your question, we'll do our best to reach out to you after the webinar. But again, if you do have questions, please feel free to send those along to the Project Spectrum team. All you have to do is go to the Project Spectrum website and look for that little question mark at the bottom of the page, and that will open up the live chat, and you can submit questions there at any time. George, again, thanks so much. We really did appreciate you sharing all this information. We hope we can have you back again, because I think there's a lot more to be said on this topic.
Great. No, it was my pleasure. I get joy out of trying to help others, especially in this world. So thank you for joining in. Hope it was worth something.